helicopter, says Lance Tregertha. That's the cheaper version.
That's a better idea.
Now, speaking of versions, a little bit of controversy over the new Wellington Monopoly game unveiled today. Oriental Bay and Lambton Quay are the Park Lane and the Mayfair. But Wainuiomata's missed out the Roxy Cinema, Cuba Street's Bucket Fountain, despite being the most popular in the public voting. Can you shed any more light on this, Rob?
No, this is news to me, but anything that sort of leaves out the Bucket Fountain is going to divide Wellingtonians very, very deeply, because really the Bucket Fountain divides the city. I think people are either staunch defenders of it or they're very embarrassed by it, and really there doesn't seem to be a great deal of middle ground on that one. So the Bucket Fountain was always going to be a kind of Berlin Wall here.
So it's not in the Bucket Fountain. I find that it's not in.
It's not in.
I find that sad.
But the Hutt River is in. The Wellington waterfront is in. Westpac Stadium is in.
Now here's another dividing thing for Wellingtonians. Is the stadium called the Cake Tin or not?
Is that still a dividing issue for Wellington?
Oh, yes.
I thought you said the Bucket Fountain was the main dividing issue.
There's a lot of divides in that.
This is kind of a proxy war in Vietnam or Korea or something.
Okay.
So it's not officially called the Cake Tin on the board, but when you're playing it, you would buy the Cake Tin, wouldn't you?
Well, this is my next point. I mean, isn't Monopoly about what you can buy? You can't buy the Hutt River. You can't buy... Well, I suppose you could buy Westpac Stadium.
You can't buy Euston Station either, unless the privatisation program's gone further than I thought.
That's a fair point that I hadn't anticipated.
And it is, the whole point of the game is to show you how appalling monopoly capitalism is. So you throw everything on the board, don't you, just to prove to people who are playing
that anything is for sale.
Terrible idea. Yes.
This river, it's yours.
And the object of the game is to bankrupt everybody else and be the sole remaining person in business.
And to sort of split up the family or the flat or whatever, and they never speak to each other again.
So you don't mind that it's morphed into a kind of city highlights game, because that's what all these individual versions of Monopoly kind of are now, aren't they?
I find it interesting. I like the classic game. I would want to play Old Kent Road and Euston Station. Yeah. But I can see that for young people adopting the game, learning the game, that making it localised is a really lovely thing to do, to have places that they recognise on it.
Although older versions are then neglected, because there was a New Zealand version with Pukekura Park as Mayfair, wasn't there? That was the highlight of...
I think so.
Which made New Plymouth very proud.
And then it becomes a moment in time. It's a little time capsule. What era of Monopoly are you playing? All that thing doesn't exist anymore.
Monopoly sales are up worldwide for Hasbro, and Monopoly and Transformers seem to have saved the bacon of the big toy maker. They are still selling. What do you think, just before we go, is the continuing appeal of Monopoly, both of you? After all these years, all this time, all this competition. Both
That's a really tough one, actually. But you're right, it has maintained its appeal. I don't know. There's something traditional about it almost. It's a real, something people can sense, maybe their grandparents played it or whatever.
Yeah, and I always, as a kid, I loved having piles of fake money.
Yeah, same.
That was really fun.
That's a big plus, yes. Yeah,
definitely. All those ingredients still in place. And the appeal, likewise. Rob Hosking, thank you very much for being on the panel today.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
And Michelle Acorn, always a great pleasure to see you.
Lovely to be here, thank you.
We're back tomorrow. Thanks for your company, everybody. And John Campbell now standing by with Checkpoint.
Kia ora everyone. Tonight on the program, well, lots and lots, but we feature a Checkpoint special investigation by Zach Fleming into one of Auckland's busiest buildings that reveals it has not had a warrant of fitness for 435 days and has been described as a fire risk. Donald Trump calls for tighter immigration and threatens to send the man responsible for yesterday's Manhattan terror attack to Guantanamo Bay. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern meets Auckland Mayor Phil Goff and tells him she's not keen on a Ports of Auckland expansion. Farmers at Fonterra's AGM say their CEO has worked hard for his $8 million salary. Staff at the Marlborough District Council share their sick leave, and Dunedin votes freedom, campers can stay, plus a sinkhole of rats and fats in Dannevirke.
RNZ News at 5. No, my, hi to my, good afternoon. I'm Paul Brennan. The mother of a murdered Christchurch man who was beaten to death before being burned says she's happy her son's killer is going away for a long time. In the High Court in Christchurch today, Peter John Carroll was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years for the murder of Marcus Tucker. The 36-year-old's body was found by Lake Ellesmere on Anzac Day last year. In a victim impact statement made in court, his mother Robin told Carroll he had taken her son away from his 3 children.
Marcus will never get to share a drink with his kids, never find a loving partner or hold his grandchildren in his loving arms. You took that all away from us. Forgiveness will never be forgiven.
Robin Tucker says it was heartbreaking having to tell her 8-year-old grandson he'd never see his dad again. A Waikato law student has lost her case challenging the last government's climate change policy. Sarah Thompson went to the High Court in Wellington in June asking it to judicially review the policy and order the government to reconsider its decisions. In a judgment released this afternoon, Justice Mallon has found that in relation to 2 of Ms Thompson's actions, the then Climate Change Minister made no error in which the court could intervene. Regarding the country's 2050 emissions targets, the judge said the new government has indicated it will reconsider that, so she didn't need to deal with that either. Justice Mallon suggests each side should be responsible for its costs. The Manus Island crisis will be high on the Prime Minister's agenda when she meets her Australian counterpart Malcolm Turnbull on Sunday. 600 refugees and asylum seekers are refusing to leave the Manus Detention Centre, which was officially closed by the Australian government earlier this week. Jacinda Ardern says New Zealand's offer to take 150 of the refugees remains on the table.
It will be something that I will discuss with Prime Minister Turnbull on Sunday, but of course that's within our wider commitment generally to make sure that New Zealand is lifting the take of refugees that it supports. Of course there is a need around Nauru and Manus, but that need also extends globally.
The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern there. Some Christchurch residents say they're bitterly disappointed the City Council has rejected a proposed sex worker bylaw. Councillors voted today not to limit the movement of sex workers in the city, favouring instead a non-regulatory approach. The bylaw has been supported by some St Albans residents north of the Central Business District who say they're being abused by prostitutes and often find needles and faeces in their driveways. A St Albans resident, Matt Bonus, says people who've had 6 years of problems with sex workers are now exploring their legal options.
What we'll also do is gather evidence, and if we need to go to High Court and identify that the council is not upholding its public places bylaw, that'll give us the evidence to do that. Obviously, we're remarkably disappointed, but we're not surprised.
St Albans resident Matt Bonus. A Marlborough District Council manager says staff have deposited 2,000 hours into a newly created sick leave bank. Philip de Broyen says the council adapted the idea from a similar scheme run by Bay of Plenty Regional Council. He says staff with more than 65 days accrued leave can choose to donate to the bank, and the pool then becomes available to those who've used up their sick leave.
We say to people, you can't donate that sick leave until you've reached a certain minimum. So you must have accrued this over years. What is surplus to the 65 days, you could then voluntarily put in a pool.
Philip de Broyen says the scheme will not cost the council extra as there is no increase in entitlement. So far, one person has applied for help. Peru's newly elected national beauty queen has pledged to act as a spokesperson for female victims of sexual violence after the contest turned into a platform for the denunciation of such crimes. 20-year-old Romina Lozano says she sought the crown to help women who have no voice, and now she is their voice. Viewers of the usually little-noticed Miss Peru contest were surprised when all 23 participants recited data on gender violence, exploitation and abuse instead of the usual announcements of their bust, waist and hip size. The contest organisers backed the participants by displaying news material on prominent cases of sexual violence. Ms Lozano herself said she'd been sexually harassed by criminals on the street. It's 5:05. On to sport now, and first 5 Bowden Barrett will captain the All Blacks for the first time in Sunday morning's match against the Barbarians at Twickenham, while 3 players are set to make their non-test debut. Rugby reporter Joe Porter has more.
The uncapped trio of hooker Asafo Almoa, prop Tim Perry and outside back Matt Duffy are all on the bench to play the Robbie Deans-coached Barbars, while the recalled wing setter Tamani Valu gets a start in his 4th test. The entire loose forward trio has been replaced, with coach Steve Hansen making 10 changes to the starting 15 from last month's loss to Australia in Brisbane. Jerome Kainoa is at number 8, with Adi Savir on the open side and Vaya Fafita on the blind. Nathan Harris is at hooker, TJ Perenara at halfback, and rookie midfielder Nani Laumape at second 5 inside Anton Leonard-Brown. David Havili replaces Damien McKenzie at fullback. This is Joe Porter.
Meanwhile, former All Black first 5 Carlos Spencer will play for the Blues at Brisbane Rugby 10s tournament in February. Tony Reddings has unexpectedly stepped down as coach of the New Zealand women's football team, the Football Ferns. The 42-year-old, who was appointed in 2011, led New Zealand to the 2012 and 2016 Olympics and the 2015 Women's World Cup. And Canadian James Piccoli has won stage 4 of cycling's Tour of Southland. The overall leader, New Zealand's Michael Torkler, finished second. That's the news.
New Zealander detained on Christmas Island.
I said, look, if you can get yourself deported, you'll never come back to Australia. You're all right with that? And he said, bloody oath.
CEO salaries under attack.
If you've got 30 people like me in the store, this would be like the most efficient coffee place in Wellington. One CEO isn't worth 30 of us.
National standards gone by lunchtime. So realistically, they could be gone at the end of this academic year.
That's certainly quite possible.
Get up and go. Guy and Espiner and Susie Ferguson on Morning Report, weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, e-patient Dave de Broncart and how getting actively involved as consumers of healthcare can literally save your life. And after 10, impressions of a model. British author Catherine Hewitt on the dramatic story of Renoir's muse, Suzanne Valadon, an artist in her own right. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
We're funded through New Zealand On Air. Now we have the short forecast from Met Services. It takes us through to midnight tomorrow, Friday. So for the northern half of the North Island, from Mount Taranaki and Taupo northwards, including Bay of Plenty, cloudy periods for the rest of today, a few light showers, rain developing tomorrow morning. For the rest of the North Island, mainly fine for the rest of today. Rain developing in the morning tomorrow, only brief falls affecting Gisborne from tomorrow afternoon. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland. Rain develops this evening or overnight. There could be some heavy falls, easing to showers tomorrow afternoon, clearing in Marlborough and Nelson. Canterbury, mainly fine, variable high cloud. A brief period of rain in the morning tomorrow. Otago and Southland, mainly fine for the rest of today. Showers at times tomorrow, some heavy. Isolated thunderstorms are possible as well from the afternoon tomorrow. At the Chathams, cloudy periods. There could be a shower or two tomorrow. It's 8 minutes past 5.
Thank you very much, Paul Brennan. You are with Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. Coming up on the program, why was one of the busiest buildings in our biggest city allowed to not have a warrant of fitness for so very long? Pooling sick leave. We go to Melbourne, where it's happening, to ask, does it work? The PM meets the Mayor of Auckland for the first time since the election, and Ports of Auckland get a cool reception to their plans, and we're looking at Fonterra, tertiary education in Northland, fat and rats in Dannevirke, and freedom camping in Dunedin. But we begin in the US, where President Trump has seized on the New York terrorist attack that left 8 people dead to call for tighter immigration measures, asking Congress to immediately end the visa program under which the suspect, an Uzbek immigrant, entered the country. Mr. Trump says he's instructed Congress to eliminate the diversity visa lottery program, which applies to countries with low rates of immigration to the US. The BBC's John Sopel reports.
He's the FBI's worst nightmare. Saifullah Saipov, an immigrant from Uzbekistan in Central Asia, who's become radicalised in the US and has barely flickered on their radar screen. As forensic experts continue to pore over the truck that he weaponised, the president is combing over America's immigration system and is demanding that the green card lottery be ripped up.
So we want to immediately work with Congress on the diversity lottery program, on terminating it, getting rid of it. We have to get much tougher, we have to get much smarter, and we have to get much less politically correct.
The tradition has always been that after a terrorist attack, when the nation is in mourning, the political class will put aside their differences and come together united. Not in today's America. Less than 24 hours after the attack in Lower Manhattan, the political battle lines have been drawn in a sharply divisive way. The president tweeted this morning that terrorists came into our country through what is called the Diversity Visa Lottery Program, a Chuck Schumer beauty. I want merit-based. The visa lottery was introduced when Republican President George H.W. Bush was in the White House. And though Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer was one of its architects, it was supported across the political divide. Today, the New York senator fired back.
The president ought to stop tweeting and start leading. The American people long for leadership, not divisiveness, not finger-pointing, not name-calling. This is a tragedy. It's less than a day then after it occurred, and he can't refrain from his nasty, divisive habits.
The Green Card Lottery allows 50,000 people from across the globe to settle in the US each year. Millions apply. In 2015, just over 4,000 came from Uzbekistan, a country that's never been on Donald Trump's target list. And in Tampa, where Saipov settled for a while, he steered clear of conventional Islam.
We've worked with the FBI on a number of cases of trying to protect youth from being targeted by groups like ISIS. And the first tactic ISIS does is try to get them away from the mosques, because they know the messaging of the mosques undermine the deviant, extremist, heretical message of groups like ISIS.
In New Jersey, where he'd been living most recently, police are trying to piece together every aspect of his life. His attack killed 8 in Lower Manhattan. It's likely to affect the immigration prospects of hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world.
That's the BBC's John Sopel in Washington. We head now to one of the busiest buildings in central Auckland, and the fact it hasn't had a warrant of fitness for 435 days and has been allowed to remain open throughout that period, despite Auckland Council formally acknowledging it was a fire risk. In the background to this story, the building's owner is being taken to court over large amounts of disputed bills. Now, we reported on this earlier this year, and we wanted to see what's changed since then. This is a major building in the heart of our largest city. This special report from Zach Fleming.
This is the building we're talking about, Skyworld on Auckland's Queen Street. Aucklanders, you probably know it. You've probably been inside it. For those of you outside Auckland, it's a multi-storey entertainment complex, one of New Zealand's biggest, nestled between Aotea Square and the Civic Theatre. It houses movie theatres, including New Zealand's only IMAX, a bowling alley, food court, games arcade, among other things. The building had been so neglected, Auckland Council considered it to be dangerous. Human smoke detectors had to be used in lieu of a fire safety system. That dangerous building notice has been lifted, but tonight Checkpoint can reveal that the building still doesn't have a warrant of fitness. Skyworld hasn't had one for 435 days. A normal day at the Skyworld building in the middle of Auckland CBD. A bowling alley, mini-golf, games arcade, mirror maze, food court, multiple movie theatres. More than 2 million people visit each year. But the building hasn't been fire compliant for years. Not since at least 2014. Issues have included faulty smoke alarms, smoke detectors, smoke extractor fans, evacuation systems. The list is exhaustive. As recently as September last year, an investigation by fire protection company First Fire found 60 defects, 37 of them critical.
From what I know of that building, I don't know that there is anyone in our industry that could put their hand on their heart and say that that building should have public inside it at any time.
Calvin Clapperton worked for Skyworld's owner as a project manager from December 2014 to August 2016. The owner is a company named J&J Holdings. It paid $37 million for Skyworld in June 2011. A man named James Quack is J&J Holdings' sole director. James Quack owns 6 companies: Pig Corporation, National Holdings, J&J Holdings, J&J Management, J&J Investment, and N Izakaya in Teppanyaki. Mr. Clapperton's assessment of Skyworld being unsafe is backed up by Auckland Council in an internal email from last October.
There is high risk involved for the occupants of the building.
And 2 of New Zealand's largest fire protection companies have also echoed Mr. Clapperton's assessment, as shown in emails released by Auckland Council to Checkpoint under the Local Government Official Information Act. Argus Fire Systems wrote to the council in June last year to say they deemed it a dangerous building. Soon after, they stopped working on the building because
it's been an ongoing issue getting approval to carry out any of the required works.
And
we've struggled with receiving payment.
More on those payment issues later. But after Argus walked away, another fire protection company got involved, First Fire. An email from them in October last year reads,
"Have had experts to site for their input and pricing. They were staggered by what they saw and questioned how the site could have ever been deemed compliant in its current state."
Mark Bishop, Managing Director of First Fire, elaborated on the phone earlier this week.
The problem simply came down to not enough money had been spent on the building to maintain it. And from what we found when we arrived on site, it hadn't been in a compliant state for an extended period of time.
The name of the October email sender was withheld by Auckland Council for privacy reasons. But they continued.
"I believe Council are aware of the issues on site, and I'm surprised they have not taken action to protect themselves against liability should an incident occur."
And they went on to question whether James Quack was life safety centred or dollar driven. If it was the latter,
then I suggest we all withdraw and Council shut the building down.
Here's Kelvin Clapperton on James Quack.
He doesn't believe he needs to comply with legislation in New Zealand. And that doesn't only apply to the building and construction legislation, that's employment law and virtually every other law.
The reason First Fire wondered how Skyworld could ever be deemed compliant is because the building was given a warrant of fitness last year. But Auckland Council knew it wasn't compliant. They issued that warrant of fitness based on a promise. James Quack signed a letter committing to fixing the issues. But there was no deadline set, and the issues were never fixed. Council emails repeatedly acknowledge no action was taken between 2014 and late 2016. But Auckland Council didn't revoke that warrant of fitness. Remember that October 2016 email?
There is high risk involved for the occupants of the building.
High risk. And this was just 4 months after at least 68 people died in the Grenfell Tower fire in London, a building where safety issues had been raised extensively beforehand, similar to how fire safety issues have been raised extensively about Skyworld. So why did Auckland Council let one of the busiest buildings in Auckland stay open, despite it being a high fire risk?
We're dealing with a building owner who's been making incremental changes over a period of time, and
he wasn't really making incremental changes, though, really, was he? I mean,
incremental changes, but very slow. And I think been making the signals that he was fully engaged and motivated to get things resolved, and certainly progress was slow.
Auckland Council's General Manager for Building Consents, Ian McCormick, says that's the most difficult position for council to be in.
The hardest situation is where they're actually going, yeah, I'm going to do it. Yep, I'm doing it now. Look, I'm doing these things, and I'm doing this a little bit extra bit, and yep, I'm doing that. That's the hardest situation because it's like a continuum. At what point are you actually going to say, I've had enough of this, and you're going to step in?
In the case of James Quack and his Skyworld building, it took years for Auckland Council to say they'd had enough. At the end of 2016, the council designated Skyworld a dangerous building, but even then they tried to keep that secret. An internal council email sent from building compliance to communications staff said,
"A notice has been attached to the building, discreetly placed at the rear entrance."
Discreetly. One of the busiest buildings in Auckland was deemed dangerous, and Auckland Council staff were worried about being discreet about it. A flurry of emails show communication staff discussing what to say if any media inquire about the dangerous building notice.
Does this look okay as a holding statement? We need to be prepared for questions. Please edit if any changes need to be made.
But it wasn't reported on until 6 months later in June on Checkpoint. It's not clear whether or not that's a result of the discreet placement of the dangerous building notice. For Skyworld to stay open with the dangerous building notice, Auckland Council demanded human smoke detectors stand guard in the food court and movie theatres. That cost James Quack $15,000 a day, and on top of that, the council threatened legal action. Suddenly, things started to get fixed. The fire alarms in the movie theatres, for example, took just 3 weeks. I asked Mr McCormick if issuing warrants on promises, as the council did last year for Skyworld, is common practice.
I wouldn't have thought so.
Okay.
Do you think that that is acceptable for that to happen?
I wouldn't.
He refused to answer that question. Skyworld hasn't been issued a warrant of fitness on time since James Quack bought it. It still doesn't have one, but it's never been shut down. Checkpoint has spent the past month trying to contact James Quack. I visited his home in Albany, a 2-minute walk from the North Shore Golf Course, complete with tennis court and CCTV cameras. All the blinds were drawn, nobody answered the door. I called his assistant Sarah outside because she'd promised to forward on James Quack's phone number the day before.
I'll just text you the number you need to call.
Yeah, that'd be great, thank you. She never texted me. I emailed James Quack directly several times. He never replied. I visited his offices 4 times. Each time I was told he was out.
Okay, I'll ask them and then find out some more details and then get back to you.
Okay, you'll give me a call back?
Yeah, okay.
You promise?
All right.
That's Min. She works for James Quack. She never called me back. I never expected her to. Nobody ever does when the question is, how do I make an appointment to see James Quack?
I'll get someone to call you to see if that's okay. Do you have a card?
That's Martin. He also works for James Quack. He thought it was funny I was even trying. On another attempt, I saw a man fitting James Quack's description leaving his offices. I'd never met James Quack, so I didn't know what he looked like. I asked the man if his name was James. Why you ask me? I'm Zach Fleming from Radio New Zealand, is it?
I have James. No? No? I'm just in a visiting there.
I showed Calvin Clapperton and another man who worked for James Quack that footage. They both said, without a doubt, that was James Quack. It's not clear why he said his name wasn't James and that he was just visiting. But even representatives from Auckland Council have said it's difficult, bordering on impossible, to contact James Quack. And emails from Compliance Consulting show he wasn't even contactable by tenants in his building. An unnamed staffer at Compliance Consulting sent several emails to Auckland Council asking for updates, because the tenants couldn't get a hold of James Quack. Apart from his nationality, Korean, little's known because nobody close to him will speak to the media. What we do know is that he's currently involved in several court cases over unpaid bills.
Commonly known that he doesn't pay his bills. Also that he just doesn't keep his word either.
Calvin Clapperton says based on his knowledge of Mr Quack's business when he left a year ago, the total amount of unpaid bills could be in the millions. He's begun testifying in court cases for people seeking overdue payments for work they did for Mr Quack.
I personally have been involved in 3 court cases and 1 determination, all of which to date have been successful in recovering the money or achieving a determination.
Why have you said yes to helping those people out?
It's wrong. What this man is doing in our country is just not right.
At a recent case in the Pukekohe District Court, Mr Clapperton says James Quack noticed him inside a meeting room.
He approached the door which had a window pane in it and made a gesture much like a pistol pointing to his temple and said, "You're an effing idiot, you're dead," and then stood there staring at me in the witness of his own team and also the person who called me as a witness, and then later approached the window again and made a slashing, throat-cutting gesture and again said, "You're dead."
Mr Clapperton says that left him shaking and scared. He says he's since filed a complaint with the police.
And I believe they're investigating at the present time CCTV footage and witness statements, so forth. Yeah, I wouldn't have made the complaint if I didn't think he was serious. And that's primarily because I think he knows that I could appear as a witness in dozens, if not over 100 cases, where he hasn't paid or he's done something illegal.
The police have refused to confirm to Checkpoint whether they're investigating the case. But Mr Clapperton says he'll continue to testify for people wanting money from James Quack.
I'll keep providing testimony until that building is sorted. It's not a personal thing with James Quack. It's just that I don't believe, on heart of hearts, that that building should ever allow a member of the public in it the way it's set up at the moment.
I asked Ian McCormick if his building consent team has enough power to force people like James Quack to do the right thing and make their buildings safe.
Enforcement tools always seem to be an ambulance at the bottom of a cliff. I mean, I'd much rather have a way of actually making building owners realise if they don't, respond, that they're going to suffer consequences.
But as yet, James Quack has not been fined or prosecuted by Auckland Council for his consistent failure to make Skyworld fire safe. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
And the cameraman was Bradley White. Restaurant brands and event cinemas who are tenants, and we want to stress that at Skyworld, were aware of the fire issues but refused to comment. For Zach's story, you are already commenting in great numbers, though. Carolyn from Tauranga says, "Hi John, appalling that the IMAX building is allowed to remain open for more than a year. If it were a little mum and pop business, then council would have shut it down months ago." Peter asks, was that building ever safe? And someone else says, why the hell is this building still open to the public? Thank you for your feedback. You can text us 2101 or email us checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. A plan by Ports of Auckland to expand and invest in its current CBD waterfront site has been dismissed as cynical and disrespectful. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is also cool on the idea, which does include a 1-hectare rooftop park, a hotel and a wharf extension. Now, the Mayor and Government want to move the council-owned port, but the company says it must still invest during the decades ahead of any relocation. Our Auckland correspondent, Todd Nile, reports.
Ports of Auckland went back to the drawing board after public protests and a legal challenge scuttled a previous reclamation plan 2 years ago. The Chief Executive, Tony Gibson, pitches the new master plan as reflecting a new reality.
The council has said and indicated to us that the port will move. That's a big call, it's a big plan, and it could potentially take up to 30 years. We still have to cope with freight demand. Auckland is growing, so that's key for us. So we've developed this 30-year master plan, which essentially gives the council time to design and build a new port somewhere else.
Ngāti Whātua Ōraki's Ngarimu Blair has a different view of the plan to extend Bledisloe Wharf, erect a parking building for thousands of imported vehicles, along with a new head office.
We think it's a pretty cynical move in that the investments that they're looking to make signal really that they're there for the long term. The Mayor campaigned on moving the port. The new government also campaigned on moving the port. And it's a bit of a finger to them, I guess, to make these kinds of announcements, which really signal they're there for the long term and aren't really interested in moving.
Stop Stealing Our Harbour is a protest group formed to successfully lead opposition to the earlier, larger and now discarded expansion plan. Its founder, Michael Goldwater, is sceptical of Ports of Auckland's latest plan.
It seems their strategy seems to be to invest as much money into infrastructure in the port so they can stay there for the longest time. What we should be doing is actually thinking about moving the port and working out ways of investing money to make the transition from an industrial waterfront to a waterfront that we can be proud of.
Moving the port is a possibility which started to be explored by Auckland's council, but has now been taken over by the government, which will frame it as a study of the Upper North Island's 3 major ports.
I just wanted to say it's been an excellent, productive first official meeting, of course.
Coincidentally, the Mayor, Phil Goff, who campaigned on moving the port, had his first formal meeting with the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, just hours after the plans went public. Ms Ardern's only comment to media on the port left plenty of room for manoeuvre.
We'll both have views on the port generally and those proposals. What I'm happy to say is that I have always opposed port expansion at its current site.
Whether the 13-metre wharf extension and the removal of Marsden Wharf counts as expansion isn't clear. Mr Goff similarly remains uncommitted, holding open the possibility that public feedback and the port company's case might prove persuasive. He says the government's study should lead the way.
The port's plans need to tie in
with what evidence shows should happen about the timing and the place of relocation of the port.
The problem there is that Ports of Auckland says it needs to seek a resource consent next year for the first big component of its master plan, the 5-level parking building capable of housing 2,600 vehicles as they roll off the ships. The company's seeking public feedback via a special website, masterplan.poal.co.nz, outlining its plans. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Todd Nile tēnei.
We head now to the Marlborough District Council, where staff aren't pulling a sickie, they're pooling them. The council's sick leave bank, in which staff can deposit surplus sick leave for colleagues to use, attracted more than 1,000 hours of paid leave immediately after it went to air in August. Here's our national Marlborough reporter, Marlborough reporter Tracy Neal.
Sue Bullfield-Johnston has worked at the Marlborough Council for 17 years and accrued roughly 80 days of sick leave. The senior administrator has just handed over 15 days of that leave to the bank.
Well, why wouldn't you, when it's a resource that is available for people when at their point of need? We all know someone who has been sick, or we may become sick ourselves. It's just something that's prevalent in all our lives.
The council's health and safety manager, Philip de Bruin, says it borrowed the idea from the Bay of Plenty Council, which operates a similar scheme. Staff with more than 65 days accrued leave can choose to donate to the bank. The pool then becomes available to those who've used up their sick leave and who are struggling physically, financially and emotionally.
So we're not having this as something that is open-ended forever. There are some limitations, and it is just to help people that are hitting hard times.
An employment law specialist, Stephen Zindel, says it's an encouraging initiative.
Because many workers only have the statutory minimum of 5 days sick leave, many employers don't really count the cost and value the worker more than the technical requirements of a contract that they only have to pay for 5 sick days a year.
So far, only one staff member has applied for help, and Philip de Bruin from the council says staff have honoured the scheme despite initial concerns it could be abused.
Isn't every Tom, Dick and Harry that had a headache after a party going to apply to the sick leave bank and say, oh, I need this, because I'm so sorry for myself? And that, of course, never happened, because I think, again, people know that other people donated this.
The donated leave can also be used by parents needing time off to care for sick children. Nelson's solo mother, Amanda Kane, says the sick leave bank is wonderful and wishes a similar scheme had been available in her former workplace. She says the stress caused by being off work through having to care for a sick child is immense.
It's difficult when your child gets sick and then you can effectively use up all of your year's leave on one bout of child sickness. And it's actually quite a distressing situation to be in, where you think, oh, what if this comes back, or what if I need to take some time off? It's going to really, affect me financially.
Back at the Marlborough Council, Sue Bullfield-Johnston says while she's been giving her leave to others who need it this time, she's happy to know there's a safety net there should she require it in the future.
If in the event I need it, I know that I can tap into this resource, so I have no hesitation in doing so. And as my time builds up and over the years, I'll continue to donate.
Meaning that staff who need extra sick leave have one less thing to worry about. In Nelson for Checkpoint, Tracy Neal.
You are with Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. Coming up to 26 minutes to 6, a little late. Paul Brennan, our apologies, but time for the headlines.
No need to apologise, John. Our headlines at this time: the mother of a murdered Christchurch man beaten to death before being burned says she's happy her son's killer is going away for a long time. Peter John Carroll was today sentenced to life in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years for the murder of Marcus Tucker. In a victim impact statement, his mother Robin told Carroll he'd taken her son away from his 3 children and he will never be forgiven. The crisis at the Manus Island detention centre will be high on the agenda when the Prime Minister meets Australian leader Malcolm Turnbull this weekend. 600 refugees and asylum seekers are refusing to leave the Manus detention centre, which has been officially closed by the Australian government. Jacinda Ardern says New Zealand's offer to take 150 of the refugees remains on the table. Excuse me. The man charged with yesterday's New York terror attack has been told he's told the police he feels good about what he did. Seyfulo Saipov killed 8 people and injured 11 by driving at high speed along a lower Manhattan bike path before being shot and injured by a police officer. From his hospital bed, the 29-year-old Uzbeki man said he'd been inspired by Islamic State videos. A Waikato law student has lost her case challenging the last government's climate change policy. Sarah Thompson wanted the High Court in Wellington to judicially review the policy and order the government to change it. Justice Mallon has found that in 2 matters, the then climate change minister made no error, and she did not need to deal with National's 2050 emissions targets because they were being changed by the new government. And the Ministry of Transport has agreed to review guidelines following a report into a digital malfunction that caused a brief air traffic control blackout. In June 2015, the Christchurch Air Traffic Service lost contact with aircraft under control for 4 minutes due to a program update. The backup systems didn't work as expected as the guidelines were out of date. Those are our headlines. Our next news and sport update will be at 6.
Thanks, Paul. We're going to look at Fonterra in some depth now. Giles Beckford next. But first of all, Fonterra's chairman denies there's an urban-rural divide, saying farmers also want swimmable rivers. Farmers gathered in Hawera today for the Milk Giants AGM. John Wilson told about 300 shareholders it's disappointing to see farmers politicised. Our Taranaki Whanganui reporter Robin Martin was at the meeting.
Fonterra chairman John Wilson told farmers gathered at the Whareroa plant in Hawera that he had expected the worst in the run-up to the election.
Being an election year, water rights and the quality of our nation's waterways were always going to be part of our national conversation. There is no rural-urban divide when it comes to water quality. We all want swimmable waterways everywhere across New Zealand. Every dairy farmer wants to pass on their land in a better condition than they found it.
Mr Wilson says dairy farming can continue to produce healthy economic returns without a cost to the environment. And it's vital the government work with Fonterra to achieve this. Inglewood farmer Victor McIntyre isn't ready to make a call on the Labour-led government, but says it's disappointing farmers are used as a political football.
It's disappointing for a start because it doesn't actually represent the real what's happening in the rural community as far as environmental effort that goes in, and certainly in Taranaki here you can see just an amazing progress that's we've made.
Fellow farmer Thomas McIntyre was more optimistic on the new government.
I don't have a problem with the new government. They will do what their election manifesto says they will do, and we will meet their needs. But we're already achieving well ahead of that in most cases anyway.
But the former National MP and coastal Taranaki farmer Shane Ardern was unsurprisingly less forgiving.
Well, I think it's a mistake. I've described it as a coalition of the losers, but that's the system we've got and that's the government we've got, so we'll work closely with them. Obviously work with a lot of those people personally, and I'm now related to the Prime Minister, so there we go.
Fonterra Chief Executive Theo Spearing warned shareholders the company needed to be prepared for the changes technological developments were having in the food industry.
We need to have that on our radar because people who connect the dots best and who are going to unlock value here, they're going to disrupt and they're going to win. And it has not happened yet in food, but it's my opinion and also John's opinion that in the coming 3 to 5 years, significant things are going to happen here.
That kind of vision is enough for Kerikeri farmer Terence Brox to justify Mr Spearing's $8 million remuneration package.
Oh, hey, when you look at the performance of the country, the company and the contribution he makes to this economy in New Zealand, I think it's bring it on. The sad thing is that there's a lot of other CEOs that get paid very large amounts, and the question should be asked is what do they contribute to this economy?
Milk production for the year was down, but despite this, the 27 payout was $6.52, up 52% on the year before. And Fonterra is predicting a $6.75 payout in 2018. In Hawera, mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Robin Martin aho.
So that's Robin at the AGM. Let's bring in our business editor, Giles Beckford, now to look at the financials. Giles, still fairly upbeat about the outlook in the cooperative, aren't they?
They are indeed, John, just as Robin was saying there. The forecast is for a payout at the moment of $6.75 a kilo of milk solids. On top of that, another 40 to 50 cents in dividends, which comes from the commercial consumer products that they sell. So all up, they'd be looking at a payout somewhere of $7.20, $7.30. That would be the best level of payout in 4 years, and it would certainly lay to rest the ghosts of the previous 2 years where we got payouts down to $4 and the like. So from that point of view, they are upbeat. It was interesting looking through the presentations that Teo Spearing was giving to the meeting, and he was laying out there what his priorities were for the coming year, or what he saw as the cooperative's priorities.
Yeah.
Among them were to get the best out of their investments in China, remembering that they have two arms to their China strategy. One is the China Farms, which is physically producing milk off farms from Chinese cows and processing it there. And the other is with Being Mate, which is a conglomerate through which it sells dairy products from New Zealand and those produced in China. Now, Being Mate is quite a controversial investment. They had quite a significant write-down in the value of Fonterra's investment in it last year, and there continue to be questions as to whether it's the best avenue for them to penetrate the Chinese market and to make progress. But in the absence of anything else or of any other entity, then clearly this is the one that they're pursuing, and this is the one that Teo Spearing is going to put all efforts into making work properly. Other priorities that they spelt out today was actually get more milk supply in Australia and to protect their milk supply in New Zealand. There are, of course, more people, more companies being set up in New Zealand who are nibbling away at the suppliers, and they want to make sure that they continue to have the market share. And they also want to grow the value of their food ingredients business. These are the specialist food products that go into the baking industry and into catering services, that sort of thing, which they regard as a multi-billion-dollar business, $2 billion in the past year. They want to double that to more than double that within the next few years as well. So from that point of view, they've set themselves some pretty rigorous targets. They'll be judged on them this time next year.
Yeah, it's fascinating business. Talking of fascinating businesses, the BNZ had a profit result today. I know Nona gave us the ANZ's last week, which was over $1 billion. How did the BNZ go?
The BNZ wasn't quite there. $937 million was the net profit after tax. That's what they call the statutory tax. That was up just under 3%. The cash profit, which is the one that excludes the value of financial instruments and bits of paper, so leaving those to one side, that was just a smidgen under $1 billion. It was a game of two halves for the BNZ essentially in the past year. The first half, they actually had a dip in their profit. They felt that squeeze on margins, fighting to retain business. Second half of the year, that turned around. They had a lift in deposits. They found that they were earning more from the loans that they were making. The margins weren't being squeezed quite so much, and their bad and doubtful debts also fell. That was a result of the improvement in the dairy sector. So a pretty good result from them. I've just spoken to Anthony Healy. He says, as he puts it, a solid result. He characterises the economy at the moment as being Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold. And that gives him confidence for the year ahead. We should note also that after 3 years at the top of the bank, he's headed back to Australia. He'll take up a senior position at the National Australia Bank, which owns the BNZ, and he'll be replaced by Angela Mentis. She'll be the first woman CEO at the BNZ, but we obviously have had women at the top in other banks, Barbara Chapman at the ASB, and Anne Sherry at Westpac many years ago. So changing face, but the BNZ's expecting reasonably good earnings for the year ahead.
Thanks, Charles. What happened on the markets today?
Top 50 index had a bit of a rebound, up 29 points to close at 8,084. The New Zealand dollar just a little firmer, or should we say that the US dollar is just a little bit on the softer side. 69.2 US cents for Kiwi and 89.6 Australian.
Giles Bickford, our business editor, thank you very much indeed. The mother of a murdered Christchurch man today described the unforgivable heartbreak of seeing her battered, bruised and broken son, who was beaten to death before being burned. Last month, the jury found Peter John Carroll guilty of murdering 36-year-old Marcus Tucker, whose body was found by Lake Ellesmere in Canterbury on Anzac Day last year. Carroll was today sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. He must serve that at the High Court in Christchurch. Our reporter Maya Burry was there, and just before we have Maya's story, a warning: if you've got kids with you, some parts of Maya's story are disturbing.
For the murder of Marcus Tucker, I sentence you to life imprisonment in order that you serve a minimum period of imprisonment of 17 years. Please stand down.
Marcus Tucker's family clapped as Peter Carroll was sentenced this morning. With them in court, a photo of the 36-year-old father of three on a wooden box containing his ashes. In a victim impact statement, Mr Tucker's sister, Belinda Ross, said Carroll would never understand the pain he had inflicted on her family. She hoped her brother's screams for mercy haunted him every day. She described the grief and trauma of seeing Mr Tucker in the morgue after his death.
His face was so badly battered, they didn't want us to see it. But we saw it, and I saw the pain he had suffered. I saw he hadn't died peacefully. I saw the bruises and burns. After we left the hospital morgue, I had to go buy new clothes as I smelt of Marcus. I smelt like his burnt flesh. I had to throw those clothes away.
Mr Tucker's mother, Robin, said Carroll had taken Marcus away from his three children, aged 18, 8 and 5, at the time he died. She said it had been heartbreaking having to tell his 8-year-old son that his dad was dead.
We relive this often as he is a curious little boy with lots of questions that we may never be able to answer. You took Marcus away from me, his dad, his brother, his sister, but you did more than that. You took Marcus away from his 3 children.
Justice Davidson said Marcus Tucker's family held no illusions around Mr Tucker's lifestyle and associations, but he said the family expected Mr Tucker would pull himself together at some stage because he was a man who in his own way loved his children. Robin Tucker said the pain and suffering had endured much longer because Carroll did not accept responsibility for murdering her son.
You prolonged it by making us sit through a trial, looking at photos of our son, hearing evidence of his murder, all while you sat there showing no remorse at all. Our dreams, our hopes, family times have been smashed, ripped away from us. Marcus will never get to share a drink with his kids, never find a loving partner or hold his grandchildren.
During the trial, the Crown said Marcus Tucker's death was a case of mistaken identity and that Carroll had intended to confront somebody else with a similar nickname. 53-year-old Carroll admitted striking Mr Tucker with the car steering wheel lock, but maintained he never intended to kill him. During sentencing today, Justice Davidson said Carroll's attack was cold-blooded and calculated.
There was evidence of your callousness in the way you carried out the assault and when you took Mr Tucker's body away in the boot of the car before setting his body alight in a futile attempt to destroy evidence. You then simply dumped him by the side of the road.
Justice Davidson said Carroll had previously committed offences in Australia and New Zealand that primarily involved drugs and dishonesty. He said Carroll's life spiralled out of control last year after he lost his job as a builder and turned to drug dealing.
You are at the same time a man who is able, intelligent and qualified to hold down a building job and to gain qualifications. Yet you lived in another world where the use of methamphetamine by you and your associates and of other drugs, including synthetic cannabis, influenced your everyday living. And that other world is very clearly why you are for sentence today.
Carroll showed no emotion as Justice Davidson sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. Mr Tucker's mother, Robin, said it was justice for her boy. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Maya Burry.
We head now to the small town of Dannevirke, where a sinkhole filled with fat and rats has prompted the local council to educate its residents on how to get rid of grease. Eva Corlett reports.
Roading contractors turned up to fix a 30-centimetre wide sinkhole on a street off Dannevirke's main strip on the 10th of October. When they put the cameras into the pipe to see what caused the collapse, they found a large build-up of fat and rats feasting on the waste. Water and roading contractor Tararua Alliance manager Chris Chapman says an accumulation caused the cavity.
Some of the fat had generated a bit of a breeding ground or feeding ground for those rats.
who then decided to chew on the concrete pipe and ended up causing the pipe to fail.
Mr Chapman says what people put down sinks is a problem.
If people are cooking a roast, don't pour the fat down the sinkhole, that type of thing. And, wet wipes and any other non-organic wastewater material or non-organic material that people typically will just flush down the toilet, that can cause some pretty big issues downstream.
Tararua District Mayor Tracy Collis was shocked by the amount of white fat plastered against the pipe. But she says while contractors saw rats in the hole, there isn't an infestation.
They noticed a few, so it certainly wasn't that many. But again, that's what you're visually seeing, so you've always got to presume that there may have been some more there. So they've dealt to those.
Ms Collis says the council and contractors are trying to identify how the fat is getting into the system. Fast food company KFC operates on the street's corner, and there are smaller outlets selling Chinese takeaways and fish and chips nearby. But Ms Collis says the greasy spoons aren't likely to be the culprits.
All of those businesses actually have, food safety and waste management plans and follow best practice with grease traps. So the fat actually has more than likely come from households. We had the discussion around some education, just around good environmental practice, having a think about what we put down the sink.
In a statement, KFC says all its used oil is collected from cookers and discarded into drums on site. It says its internal drains go through a two-stage process to remove any grease or solids from places like floors and benches before entering water pipes. But a Watercare spokesperson, Peter Rogers, says grease traps can become inadequate.
It may change hands and you've got double the volume going through or the capacity. And then there's also the education of the staff as well, in terms of a lot of food restaurants will dispose of waste oils to a recycler, but then you've got your rinsing of your plate and ensuring that those are segregated out into the solid waste, and the minimal amounts of fat, oil and grease go down the drain.
So far, New Zealand hasn't become prone to enormous sewer fat deposits called fatbergs, like places such as London, due to its size. But Mr Rogers says build-ups or chokes are still extremely common. Tracy Collis says the sinkhole has been fixed, but the council will run cameras through other parts of the system to check for more build-ups. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Eva Corlett, tēnei.
From Dannevirke to Northland, where the region's only polytech plans to cut courses and close campuses so that it can focus on teaching skills that lead to, quote, well-paid jobs. The polytech, having projected a small surplus for the year, now says it's facing a loss of $4.5 million. Lois Williams reports.
It's been a serious blow for the small town of Rauene in Hokianga. Northtech's announced it will rest the campus for a while, along with the Kerikeri campus, while it restructures. That's edu-speak for close for a while. But the locals say there's no guarantee their campus will reopen, and the courses it now offers in trades and social work and computer studies will be gone. A Rauene school teacher, Julia Parker, says Northtech's a vital part of the community and people are feeling bereft.
They're most upset about it, and particularly yesterday one of the students had gone to course and the tutor there had decided that he was no longer going to keep going because of the proposed redundancy and closure of the campus.
Northtech says it has to restructure. It says student numbers in certain courses such as applied arts, computing, sports, business and tourism have been dropping for some time. It wants to create 39 new jobs in courses that now thrive, like trades training and nursing. Courses that will lead to well-paid jobs. Prominent whangare painter Lawrence Berry has been an arts tutor at Northtech on and off for nearly 30 years. He says the course does lead to jobs, but that shouldn't determine the fate of an arts course.
You know, it was interesting when I was listening to Mr Peters when he was announcing that they would go with Labour, and he quoted the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want. He didn't quote educators, philosophers, mathematicians, he quoted artists, musicians. And this is part of what the arts are. They're not only about job outcomes. They are the people who volunteer in our community. They are people who have been taught to think creatively, to think about the effects of culture on theirs and others' lives. So the job outcomes one, I think, is erroneous. I don't think that's something we need to go down again.
Until recently, Northtech was also running 2 campuses for international students in Auckland, one in Queen Street and one in Newmarket. But the one in Newmarket closed earlier this year after a complaint to the NZQA about the validity of its assessments. Northtech ended its relationship with a third-party provider and moved the students to Queen Street. It says the Auckland campus now pays for itself. But a former Northtech tutor, Justin Blakey, says it's ironic that Northtech can afford to educate foreign students in the big city, but not young people in the region it was created to serve.
That is outright wrong, that something's wrong there. They've marginalised the young people in the areas of Northland through making those economic choices. And it may not be solely Northtech's fault, but there was increasing pressure from central government to make these institutions had to make money,
The president of the Tertiary Education Union, Sandra Gray, says polytechs were forced to compete for funding by the former government, and that's done nothing for regional services. She says the union's hoping the new Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, will intervene.
There just isn't the money, and they just aren't well supported enough, and they've struggled to make ends meet, and this is the final consequence of years of those processes going on, and not a great position for a chief executive in a council to be in, to have to make these sorts of cuts because of a broken system.
The chief executive of Northtech, Mark Ewan, wouldn't agree to an interview for Checkpoint, but his PR man says polytechs these days have to teach to the job market, and that means running courses that lead to viable careers, not low-wage futures. For Checkpoint, Lois Williams.
We turn now to art, cat, fur and Donald Trump. Well, Amy Baker did. She's taken the fur she brushes from the coats of her much-loved cats, Oscar and Monty, and built striking embroidery portraits out of it. And one, the fur gives Donald Trump his very distinctive hairdo. Remarkably, strikingly similar. But we start, and you can see this online, with how it all began and with whom.
We've got cats that just love being groomed, and their fur is very, very fine. And just sort of after I'd sort of groomed one of the cats that night, I sort of just playing with the fur, and it sort of felted up quite nicely. And then we might have been watching TV or something anyway. Gareth Morgan popped up, and it was like Gareth Morgan on cats,
Wait a sec. So you'd groomed the cats. You were holding the fur. The fur was felting, and Gareth Morgan popped up.
It was something like that, or he might have popped up in conversation. It's a couple of years ago since I got the original concept.
That's a message from the divine when all of those did it, isn't it? Someone is saying, "Hey, Amy, this is your destiny."
I have described it as being when my subversive brain and my stitching brain collided.
Yeah, it's exactly what it was.
But no, that was sort of where it came from. But then I mulled over it for a few years, just trying to figure out how to actually put it together, and actually also upskilling myself in terms of my techniques, so I could then sort of go ahead. Because at the time that I had the idea, I actually didn't know how to do the portrait.
So Gareth Morgan is on a bed of cat fur. But President Trump, what did you call that piece, Amy?
Where's the pussy, Mr. President?
Brilliant. But President Trump, his hair is made out of fur from your cats.
Yes, and also my head, because I used some real human hair, my own hair, in the embroidery as well.
Wow. It's kind of magnificent and nuts at the same time.
Absolutely. What I was doing, I knew it was going to get a reaction, but that was also why I did it, because with that piece and with the name and with the theme of it, what I was trying to create is trying to recreate that sort of level of, absurdity and that sort of recoiling, sort of ick factor that people often sort of, the reactions that people have to Trump.
Obviously, I couldn't possibly comment on that, working as I do for public radio, but let's talk about working with the cat fur. So once you've made up your mind you're going to do it, and once you've started felting it, which is a sort of tactile response to having it in your fingers, I guess, what's it like to work with?
It's really soft. This particular fur is really soft and really enjoyable to stitch on. The Gareth Morgan piece, because I was stitching the entire, the entire face and almost all of the body is actually the upper body is on the cat fur. It was very, very soft to work for, very easy to work for. It is very fine, so I've never yet threaded it. It's always been sort of laid and then stitched down, or but it's relatively enjoyable. And also I know that my cats have given it lovingly. They adore being brushed, and I'm sure they'll probably quite appreciate the way that I've used their fur.
Amy Baker, you can see Gareth Morgan and Donald Trump online. Donald, the cat's fur works so well on Donald Trump's head that one is beginning to wonder if in fact he has just a trained cat permanently sitting there.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Paul Brennan. Prosecutors in New York have filed terror charges against the Uzbek immigrant accused of killing 8 people in a truck attack yesterday. The FBI says it has also now located a second Uzbek man wanted for questioning. The BBC's Nada Tawfik reports.
Just over 24 hours after Saifullah Saipov sowed terror in Lower Manhattan, he was brought into a federal courthouse in a wheelchair with his hands and feet shackled. He was accused of providing material support to IS and causing the deaths of 8 people by plowing into civilians with reckless disregard for human life. Prosecutors say Saipov was consumed by hate and a twisted ideology. Acting U.S. Attorney June Kim said the Uzbek national would face the full weight of the law.
Nada Tawfik in New York there. The Auckland Council has allowed one of the city's busiest buildings to stay open without a warrant of fitness for more than a year without punishing the owner. The 6-storey Skyworld building in Upper Queen Street houses 12 movie theatres, 11 restaurants, a food court and retail stores. It failed to get a warrant for 2016 because of extensive fire safety problems that included faulty smoke alarms, detectors, extractor fans and evacuation systems. It still hasn't got one, but the council has decided not to fine or prosecute the owner, James Quack. An investigation has revealed a digital malfunction was to blame for a communication blackout at Christchurch Air Traffic Control. In June 2015, controllers lost contact with aircraft under their control for 4 minutes because of a program update. In a report released today, the Transport Accident Investigation Commission says the backup systems did not work as expected, as the guidelines were out of date. It recommends they be updated. The Ministry of Transport has agreed to review the guidelines, taking technological developments into account. The National Party leader, Bill English, says his party is now ready to be a strong opposition and hold the government to account. Mr English today allocated policy responsibilities to all his MPs, apart from newly elected ones. Many former ministers have retained their areas of interest, though Judith Collins has picked up transport and Louise Upston social development. Mr English says National will keep a very close eye on the impacts of the government's economic decisions.
There's a lot of work to do because the early signs are that they're quite happy making decisions which are going to make it harder for them to maintain that level of economic performance.
Bill English. National has nominated Anne Tolley for Deputy Speaker. 6,000 people are to lose their jobs in a restructuring announced today by the National Australia Bank. The bank says the impact of new technology and online banking has cut a swathe through its traditional systems. The ABC's Rebecca Hyam reports.
NAB hasn't revealed exactly which divisions the job cuts will be in, but the more traditional parts of the bank may be affected. The bulk will be in Sydney and Melbourne. The redundancies will be spread over 3 years in an effort to save $1 billion. NAB's Chief Executive Andrew Thorburn says more customers are choosing digital options for their banking needs.
There's no doubt that our industry is going to have to significantly reshape our workforce, and that's what we're facing into.
The news comes as NAB revealed a full-year net profit of $5.3 billion and a record cash profit of $6.6 billion.
Rebecca Hyam reporting there. The Corrections Department is sticking to its claim that it was acting in good faith when it held some prisoners longer than it should have, saying it should be excused from compensating them. The department has asked the Court of Appeal to overturn an earlier ruling that it must compensate the men. Here's our court reporter Anne-Marie May.
Shane Gardner claimed he had been jailed for 30 days longer than he should have, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favour. Its judgment contained a new formula for calculating release dates, and the High Court then awarded him $10,000 compensation. Correction says compensation should only be payable to people jailed too long in the future, but Gardner's lawyer said that was not a correct reading of the earlier decision. He also said it was incorrect to suggest someone like Gardner might not be so badly affected by the error because he'd spent plenty of time in prison. The court reserved its decision. This is Anne-Marie May.
Researchers have been given $750,000 to discover whether Otago sea squirts hold the answer to human limb regeneration. The study will receive $820,000 from the Royal Society's Marsden Fund. Megan Wilson of Otago University's Anatomy Department says the research will focus on how sea squirts, which have the same genes as humans, heal themselves and regenerate tissue.
So we want to know sort of how and why it does this and why sometimes it can heal and what stops it from undergoing like a regeneration and forming more organs and more tissues. And that's kind of what we're interested in with respect to humans, in that we can sort of heal and form scars, but we're not very good at regenerating whole tissues.
Megan Wilson of Otago University. It's 6:05. On to sport now, and the Houston Astros have beaten the Los Angeles Dodgers 5-1 in Game 7 to win American Baseball's World Series for the first time in their 55-year existence. The Astros clinched the best-of-7 series 4-3. First five, Bowden Barrett will captain the All Blacks for the first time in Sunday morning's match against the Barbarians, while three players are set to make their non-test debut. The uncapped trio of hooker Usafo Almur, prop Tim Perry and outside back Matt Duffy will all be on the bench at Twickenham. There are 11 changes to the starting 15 from last month's loss to Australia in Brisbane. And outgoing New Zealand women's football coach Tony Redding says the all-encompassing nature of the role played a big part in his decision to suddenly step down after 6 years in the job. After taking the football ferns to the brink of the world's top-tier teams, he says it was time to step aside.
It's always in a battle to try and compete with the best teams in the world, and typically what you do is you work harder than other countries, and you attempt to work smarter. And like I said, that does, after a while, that takes its toll on you. And then for me, it's like, okay, well, it's time to let someone else resume that challenge, and then I can focus on myself and the family, and then so hopefully someone can come in and do an even better job than what's been done in the past.
And that's the departing football ferns coach Tony Redding, and that's the news.
Tonight on Nights, raising our boys to become men, not macho men, but decent men, capable of self-discipline, compassion and consideration for others, male or female, which means, chaps, we're going to have to lead by example. Well, this week's cultural ambassador Chris Janidis brings his modern dance sensibilities to bear on the most classical ballet of them all, Swan Lake. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now we have the short forecast from Met Service taking us through to midnight tomorrow, Friday, the end of the week already. The northern half of the North Island from Mount Taranaki and Taupo northwards, including Bay of Plenty. Cloudy periods for the rest of today. A few light showers. Rain will develop tomorrow morning. For the rest of the North Island, mainly fine. For the remainder of the day, rain develops in the morning. Only brief falls affecting Gisborne from tomorrow afternoon. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland. Rain develops this evening or overnight. Heavy falls, then easing to showers tomorrow afternoon and clearing in Marlborough and Nelson. For Canterbury, it'll be mainly fine. Variable high cloud. A brief period of rain in the morning tomorrow. Otago and Southland, mainly fine. For the rest of today, showers at times tomorrow, some heavy. And isolated thunderstorms are possible tomorrow afternoon. At the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with the odd shower tomorrow. It is exactly 6:08.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul Brennan. You are with Checkpoint on RNZ, and we are delighted to have your company. An enormous amount of feedback coming in tonight on the story that we had about an hour ago, which is about Skyworld, a very large complex on Auckland's Queen Street. Extremely busy, has an IMAX, multiple cinemas, a food court, bowling alley, the whole 9 yards, and it hasn't had a warrant of fitness for a year and a half. It has been described formally, actually, as a fire risk by the Auckland Council. Really strange lack of firm policing around that building. Lots of feedback on Zach's story. Phil Goff needs to be made aware of the narrative of your report and promise to provide an action plan, says John Weston from New Plymouth. Nice to hear from you, John. John says, thrilled to hear this. Well, sorry, no, that's very nice, John. Thank you. We'll John's just congratulating me on something that's very kind. But we do want to say we did ask Phil Goff to talk about Sky World, and he wasn't able to. Great news story from Zach et al. Impressively constructed and presented. A great listen. Thanks, Tony. And yes, Tony, I agree with you. It was wonderful work by Zach. Whereas the Auckland Mayor Council is responsible for safety, Mr Goff, we would like to invite you on to Checkpoint. Auckland City Council, shame, double shame on you. Mr Goff, I voted for you, sort this out, man. She's talking about the owner of the building. Hi, John, just listen to your item on the non-compliant Auckland CBD building. That situation is totally unacceptable. In my opinion, priority number one for any authority is the safety of its citizens. Shut the place down until it complies, says another John. And finally, from an enormous amount of feedback we received, thank you for your great investigation. Please ask the Auckland Mayor to urgently close Skywell until it's safe and to seek an independent inquiry into why his council has failed to take action before now. Has the council or its officer received incentives to not protect the public? If Mr Goff wants the public to ever trust his council, this is his opportunity, says Paul. We will go back to the Mayor and his office on this. Thank you. A master plan that balances Auckland's economic, social and environmental needs, or a cynical step aimed at stopping the long-term relocation of the city's port. Ports of Auckland today unveiled its 30-year plan, which includes building a 5-storey car park complete with a rooftop park, a hotel and a 13-metre extension to Bledisloe Wharf. Now, the council-owned company went back to the drawing board on its future after public protests and a legal challenge scuttled a previous reclamation plan 2 years ago. Its chief executive, Tony Gibson, pictures the new master plan as reflecting a new reality.
The council has said and indicated to us that the port will move. That's a big call, it's a big plan, and it could potentially take up to 30 years. We still have to cope with freight demand. Auckland is growing, so that's key for us. So we've developed this 30-year master plan, which essentially gives the council time to design and build a new port somewhere else.
That's Tony Gibson. It wasn't just Auckland's port that was in the spotlight today. Plans are apparently on track for light rail in Auckland, with the new government giving the go-ahead to funding its share of the Auckland transport commitments it did make during the election campaign. The confirmation came after the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and the Auckland Mayor Phil Goff had their first official meeting at the Beehive this morning. Our political reporter Sarah Robson has more on this.
I don't know whether I should shake hands or just give you a hug. Congratulations. Welcome you back to your old haunt, Phil. Yeah.
It was a hug, not a handshake, to start this morning's meeting between the two former Labour Party colleagues. The pair had a lot to talk about: light rail to the airport, a regional fuel tax, the future of the port and the handling of the government's house building program. But the key decision out of today's meeting was Ms Ardern confirming the government will fund its share of the Auckland transport plans Labour announced during the campaign. She says while the government does need to contribute, the Auckland Council needs to play its part and find efficiencies.
We've always acknowledged that Auckland should have some skin in the game and that Aucklanders know we have problems we need to resolve. The regional fuel tax allows us to do that, and that's a mechanism we've been happy to offer to Council to enable them to deliver these projects.
Phil Goff says at the moment there are 800 new cars on Auckland's roads each week, which is unsustainable.
I've looked around at different models around the world. It is very clear that Auckland has to have a mass transit system. What we're doing in rail is really good, it'll make a big difference. But we need to have light rail.
Mr Goff says a regional fuel tax will bring in between $1.2 and $1.5 billion over a 10-year period. He says that's preferable to the alternatives.
We would have to put rates up by probably around 15%, which would be totally unsustainable. Or we would have to introduce a congestion tax, which I think in London at the moment is running at $21 a day. The regional fuel tax is on average probably $2.60 a week for the average motorist.
Light rail from the CBD to the airport is expected to cost around $2.5 billion. Decisions around how much of that bill the government and council will each foot are still to be made. Mr Goff says the government and council are also committed to looking into targeted rates as another way of raising revenue to pay for infrastructure.
Sometimes when the ratepayer and the taxpayer puts in new infrastructure, it creates creates a massive uplift in the value of properties. And I think in principle it's fair that if you're getting a massive uplift in the value of your property, that you make a contribution to the infrastructure that lets that happen.
Meanwhile, the Labour-led government has also confirmed it will scrap the East-West motorway link project in its current form. But Ms Ardern says they do need to look at the congestion problems that led to the project being proposed in the first place. Atu i te whare paremata mo te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sarah Robson, aho.
Security officials in the US say that lone wolf attacks of the type Manhattan witnessed yesterday will continue to be orchestrated by self-radicalised Islamic State sympathisers to keep the idea of the caliphate alive. An Uzbek immigrant, Saifullo Saipov, has been charged with mowing down 8 people under a truck, injuring a further 11. Police now say it appears his motivations in the attack itself are right out of the Islamic State playbook. CNN's Brian Todd reports.
Before he slaughtered 8 people and got out of his rented truck yelling Allahu Akbar, Saifullo Saipov was not on any terror watch lists, officials say, and not the direct subject of any New York police or FBI investigations. But they say Saipov was likely connected to individuals who were the subjects of investigations, and they offer another clue.
He was associated with ISIS, and he was radicalized domestically.
Officials say Saipov has lived in Ohio, Florida, and Paterson, New Jersey. They aren't yet saying how or when Saipov was radicalized in the U.S.
What's your best take on how he was radicalized?
In many cases, it's a combination of online and offline radicalization. People start hanging out with like-minded individuals, people who embrace ISIS ideology, and then they go online to sort of reinforce their nascent jihadist views. In many cases, people radicalize because they have some personal issues, whether it could be, family problems or, job problems.
Expert Lorenzo Vidino says the process of becoming radicalized means spending a lot of time online.
Now it's apps like Telegram, like others that are very easy to download on your phone. They're mostly encrypted, and you can get all sorts of information. You can interact with other people. You can reinforce your ideological commitment to ISIS. You can get operational instructions.
And officials believe Saipov had close familiarity with operational instructions.
He appears to have followed almost exactly to a T the instructions that ISIS has put out in its social media channels before, with instructions to their followers on how to carry out such an attack.
One of the most popular instruction manuals Saipov might have read online in the ISIS magazine Rumiyah last year. It discusses how to use rental trucks to attack crowds and inflict maximum casualties. Quote, vehicles are like knives, it says, and it urges attackers to announce their allegiance to the terror group. Quote, an example of such would be simply writing on dozens of sheets of paper, the Islamic State will remain. Very similar to a note officials say Saipov left in his vehicle. For ISIS, experts say lone wolves offer an easier way to strike at soft targets without the extensive planning and skill used in attacks like Paris.
That was CNN's Brian Todd with that report, 6:17. Michael Fallon has resigned as UK Defence Secretary, admitting that his behaviour towards women has fallen short as the Conservative Party struggles to contain the growing scandal about sexual harassment at Westminster. Allegations of inappropriate behaviour have been swirling around the UK Parliament since the Harvey Weinstein abuse scandal encouraged women to speak out about their experiences of abuse or harassment. Mr Fallon's name was one of 40 on a sleazeless spreadsheet compiled by party staff and given to journalists. The ABC's Anne Barker is in London.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the question of the sex harassment...
It's not Hollywood, but the sex abuse scandal that began with Harvey Weinstein last month has opened a floodgate that now threatens to engulf politics in Westminster.
In recent days, allegations have been made about MPs' conduct, including my own.
One of the most senior ministers in the British government, Defence Secretary Michael Fallon, has resigned after admitting he behaved inappropriately towards a woman half his age.
Many of these allegations have been false, but I realise that in the past I may have fallen below the high standards that we require of the armed forces that I have the honour to represent. I have reflected now on my position in government, and I am therefore resigning as Defence Secretary.
It's the latest in a series of allegations of sleaze and sexual misconduct by men in power in Britain. Just yesterday, the UK's first Secretary of State, Damien Green, denied allegations splashed in the Times newspaper that he'd made unwanted advances towards an academic.
Is it right that Downing Street investigate you?
All the allegations are completely false. Thank you.
Prime Minister Theresa May has ordered a Cabinet Office investigation into the claims surrounding her deputy. But in the last 48 hours, more allegations have emerged. A Labor activist says she was raped by a senior member of her party and warned not to report it. Another anonymous staffer says she was sexually assaulted by an MP while on a work trip. And a former Labor intern, James Greenhalgh, says he was assaulted by a former MP 5 years ago.
This Member of Parliament, he put his arm around me, but then his hand slowly went down and, yeah, he sort of took advantage of that situation. I didn't know really what to do. It sounds stupid, but I can remember just going home and just having a shower, and it wasn't like I'd been raped or anything like that, but I felt violated still, you know, it was awful.
Prime Minister May is under pressure to do more.
And I've written to all party leaders, inviting them to a meeting early next week so we can discuss a common, transparent, independent grievance procedure for all those working in Parliament.
Theresa May has told the House of Commons it's time to find new ways of dealing with allegations of sexual misconduct.
We need to ensure that those cases are dealt with in a way that people can have confidence on both sides that they will be properly investigated.
But many unverified claims and unsubstantiated smears have also been published online. A spreadsheet listing 40 Tory MPs accused of inappropriate conduct was released to journalists. And after it found its way onto social media, the Justice Minister Dominic Raab felt he had no option but to speak out.
I've got no idea about the truth of the various things that are on that list of 40. Some seem to range from very serious accusations, others seem salacious gossip, but I can account for what's under my name. And the entry reads, injunction for inappropriate behaviour with a woman. Well, I've never been served with any injunction. I've never sought an injunction. I've never done anything amounting to sexual harassment, sexual abuse or anything of that nature.
Nevertheless, many MPs agree there's a cultural problem at Westminster that must change. As in Hollywood, nobody knows how far these allegations will spread, but there's optimism too that behaviour once accepted as normal is finally being exposed.
Anne Barker, the reporter there, 21 minutes past 6. There are fears 2 of Dunedin's coastal communities will be inundated with freedom campers after the city's council shot down a proposed ban this week. Residents and camping ground owners in Brighton and Warrington are scratching their heads as to how the proposal was voted down against the recommendations of staff and the majority of the community. Timothy Brown reports.
The soundtrack of breakers hitting the sand at Ocean View Beach is a big attraction for residents. But as summer rolls around, it's a different soundtrack which is causing angst. A constant stream of visitors to the beach, often throughout the night, has some residents seeing red. One, who did not want to be named, says Dunedin's councillors have let the community down by rejecting the ban on freedom campers.
It's sad, isn't it? Because that's a reflection of the community. That's what they wanted, those who complained, and they're just overridden. Nobody really cares about us, do they? It's obvious. This was my lovely spot, and they just destroyed it.
He says he isn't opposed to freedom campers per se.
I'm not against freedom camping, but pick your spot. Use a bit of common sense. They must have plenty of property all over Dunedin, ground that they own. Put them in there. Put them on industrial parking, because all they're doing is sleeping there the night.
Nearly 3/4 of the community supported the ban, but it was voted down by councillors, 8 votes to 6. Waikawaiti beach camping caravan park owner Stuart Elwood says he cannot fathom why the council would vote against the wishes of its residents.
The majority of people don't want freedom campers. Why and how it has got to the point where council just override it, I don't understand that. They have had their difficulties and their challenges in the 2 locations they've had to date. What do they think is going to change now then, being that they have basically continued to licence this sort of behaviour.
Stuart Elwood says he's offered to work with the council to accommodate freedom campers and address the issues they create. The problems faced by the two communities and the heated feeling of some residents led Dunedin Mayor Dave Cull to make an impassioned plea to councillors to side with locals.
If the rest of the South Island has one rule and we have another, and they all come here, I think we'll be back in this chamber within a year, desperate to find a way out of the situation that we've got ourselves into by not listening to our community.
He says the problem has not gone away simply because the ban was rejected.
It'll come back to council. The option that we may have to develop needs to be one that gives councillors confidence that it can be implemented and enforced. And it may be that it's some kind of hybrid where there is a limited capacity for freedom campers, and it may be that it involves other agencies like DOC.
But in the meantime, for tourists like Alex Braun, freedom camping is a cheap way to see the country. And he's not the only one.
4 weeks ago was the last time in Dunedin, and we tried to sleep here, but it was full. The whole parking space was full of people. So
Alex Braun says Dunedin's willingness to accommodate non-self-contained campers is a point of difference, and many skip through neighbouring council areas like Queenstown Lakes and Waitaki due to their bans. But for the communities faced with thousands of visitors this summer, knowing they are garnering positive reviews is cold comfort. In Dunedin, for Checkpoint, Timothy Brown.
Coming up to 25 minutes past 6, we would love your feedback on that if you're listening in Dunedin, Texas, 2101, or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. Let's head from Dunedin to Vanuatu, where the islands of Ombai. The islanders there are returning to their island, but their problems are far from over. Forced to flee to neighbouring islands when Ombai's volcano erupted more than a month ago, the residents were allowed to return home from evacuation centres last week. Extraordinary evacuation procedure getting everyone off the island, but now they're having to contend with contaminated water supplies, missing livestock, smothered crops and a drought. Jamie Tahana reports.
Ombai's more than 10,000 residents were evacuated in late September when the volcano at the island's centre blanketed it in ash. But with the volcano settling down, the decision was made last week to return the residents to their home island. However, the Red Cross's Dickinson Tevi says the crisis is far from over, with food and water in short supply.
The vegetation are really badly damaged, and the water is definitely thick with the volcanic ash. Unless a big heavy rain, the situation is really not any good.
Mr Tevi, who was on Ombai a few days ago, says the southern and western parts of the island are the worst affected. Ombai was already in the grips of drought before the eruption, and Mr Tevi says whatever water is left has been contaminated by ash. He adds that crops that were already struggling have been smothered, and livestock that was left to roam when the island was evacuated has disappeared. Mr Tevi says islanders continue to rely on relief supplies. Provincial authorities are considering a range of measures, including further, albeit smaller, evacuations.
From the report from the disaster coordinator on South Ombai, it is actually really worse there. So they might have to be relocated to areas of the east. That is not a plan that is happening yet, but that is what he saw as a possibility.
The head of the National Disaster Management Office, Shadrach Wellington, stresses another evacuation would be an absolute last resort, and the government continues to deploy food and water supplies. He says the residents could be reliant on relief supplies for a couple of months yet, at least until the start of the rainy season.
We'll continue to provide people with food and water until such time when situations come to normal again. We're hoping that as of today, it's the beginning of wet season. Hopefully we'll have some rain to address the issue with water security on the island.
Despite the struggles, Dickinson Tevi says the decision to return the people of Ombai to their homes from the evacuation centres, where they were reliant on relief supplies anyway, was the right one. Meanwhile, Shadrach Wellington says his office is carrying out a review into how the evacuation of Ombai was handled and what lessons can be learnt. This is Jamie Tahana.
Lots of feedback in tonight about Zach Fleming's story. So I just drifted off there. Lots of feedback about Zach Fleming's story on Skywell on Queen Street in Auckland. Thank you, all of you who have been in touch. The Skywell building is very creatively designed, probably award-winning architecture, but the reality is that it's almost impossible to find your way around. I would hate to have to try to find your way out in a hurry, in an emergency. Thank you, Peter, in Auckland. And Dale says, hi, John, the internal design of that Queen Street building has always worried me. It has odd angles and corners to the extent that if it was smoke-filled, it would be so difficult to find your way out. It could be a death trap. Close it or take it off him. He obviously can't afford to fix it and does not care. Well, that's Dale's opinion. We would love to hear from the owner, James Quark, who has seemingly avoided our repeated attempts to approach him. We've gone to his home, we've gone to his office, we've contacted his staff. We even do believe that Zach saw him, although whoever it was denied it was him and left at speed. We really would love to hear from him. We'd also love to hear from anyone who has had any dealings with him that they would like to talk to us about on or off the record. You can text us 2101. Possibly email would be better in those circumstances. checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. Lots of lovely feedback coming in tonight, for which I'm very grateful and I really appreciate it. But I also want to point out really strongly that Checkpoint is made by a wonderful team, brilliantly led by our executive producer, Pip Keane, our associate producer, Catherine Wallbridge, our producer, Bridget Burke, who is so good at getting people onto the show, our digital producer, Michelle Cook, Zach Fleming, our brilliant reporter, Kelvin Samuel, our tireless director, Jeremy Veal on sound. The head of radio at RNZ is Carol Hirschfeld, and Checkpoint was her idea. All of those people help me do the job I do and make me look better than I really am. Thank you for being with us. We'll be back tomorrow at 5.
RNZ News headlines now at 6:30. The Auckland Council has let one of the city's busiest buildings stay open without a warrant of fitness for more than a year without punishing the owner. The mother of a murdered Christchurch man beaten to death has greeted the sentence of at least 17 years behind bars handed down to his killer, Peter Carroll. 6,000 National Australia Bank staff are losing their jobs because of restructuring brought about by new technology. And the American President Donald Trump has called for the 29-year-old man who killed 8 people in New York with a speeding truck to be given the death penalty. Our next news and weather will be at 7.
After 1 p.m. tomorrow, chef Michael Meredith shares a recipe for tuna tartare. We get a live performance from new musical group The Beths, and astrophysicist Richard Easter looks at Te Ao Marama, the new Centre for Fundamental Inquiry, which asks questions that promise to transcend disciplinary boundaries.